relations, and we have other people who are experts on European issues. So we try to adapt, and I think a firm would try to find people who have a particular background in one area or another, and perhaps they've also studied the culture and the languages of those particular areas. Now, the question of how do you find somebody who has got the inborn negotiating skills, well, you do that by just trying them out. It's you find who are your better negotiators. But I should add that not all kinds of negotiations are the same. There are some negotiations. There are like traditional rug merchant and the bazaar type of negotiation. And that is more sort of an inborn skill. But the other kind of negotiation, which is one where you try to identify the issues, identify the mutual interests of the parties, and then try to come up with creative solutions, that is something that many people can do. You don't necessarily have to have sort of the inborn skills of a bazaar negotiator to do that.
Mr. Recupero.
Yes, I would like only just to add that a balanced personality is an essential requirement for a good negotiator. In any case, people who are too soft or too tough are not good negotiators. The good negotiator is a man of balance who is able to understand his counterpart's position and point of view.
Our next question is from the Instituto Tecnológico de Acapulco, en Acapulco, en el estado de Guerrero, en México.
Buenos días. Muy bien. I am Jorge Vidal from Acapulco Instituto Tecnológico. The question is, how can we negotiate successfully between Latin American countries and European countries, given that we don't really have a lot of business commercial diplomats who have been trained in this field? What do you suggest?
Okay, the question is, how do we negotiate between Latin America and Europe when we have a lack of commercial diplomats that have actually been trained in this discipline? How do we begin?
Well, the way you begin is just having people get experience by doing it. Of course, that is a very inefficient way of doing it because you make a great many mistakes before you become proficient. So hopefully we will find more and more cases where there will be formal training available. We have such a program at the Monterey Institute, and I know that there are many other universities around the world who are beginning to offer courses, but in the past that was just not available, and basically you learned on the basis of the age-old apprenticeship system. You joined a firm or a trade ministry, and you learned from more experienced, more senior people. Now, if you are a new country and you don't have these senior experienced people, then you need to get some of the expertise from elsewhere in order to get the initial training, to get you up to speed.
I would like also to remind our friend Mr. Vidal that the Latin American countries have had some experience with the European negotiators in Brussels, and for some years we have been trying to open the European market, particularly for agricultural goods. And I would say there is a limited number of people, but very competent people, engaged in those negotiations. My second point is that besides the government representatives, we do need people from the business sectors. We now have from some sectors, for instance, the soya beans and the soya meal exporters. They have a representation in Brussels. And in the past we had some representations from the textile industry. But we need to have more and to learn from the U.S. experience, because the U.S. private sector has always been very present in the negotiations.
Our next question is from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development from Geneva, Switzerland.
De la Ginebra.
Thank you. My question directly relates to the question posed by the Mexican colleague. And this has to do with the imbalance of both sides of negotiators. Now, the big economies, big market economies, not only do they have experienced negotiators, commercial diplomats, but also they are backed by institutions. They have secretariats, institutions, which give them expertise, back them with theoretical background, and help them until the end of the negotiations. To the contrary, for example, the African countries do lack such institutions. When one negotiates with the other side, if the level playing field is not to an equal norm, it doesn't necessarily result in protecting its own interest. To keep the interest of both sides, the level playing field should be as equal as possible. Now, how could we talk about the world growth that the world is benefiting, the whole world is benefiting today from the new world trade policy, where the other negotiating party lacks the negotiating skills and institutions which back the negotiation, and the others they have. Thank you.
Mr. Fekete-Kuri.
Well, I think that is the challenge that we have to face as a world community. In fact, I've had very good discussions with Mr. Recupero on this, on how UNCTAD could be very helpful. As you also know, that the UNCTAD and the WTO have had the Joint International Training Center, which has provided this kind of training. Many countries have aid programs to try to help negotiators, and I think you're absolutely right. In order to have a level playing field, both sides have to be equally well trained and represented. And I think the challenge for all of us is to make sure that that becomes a reality.
Yes, I fully share my friend Geza's opinion, and I believe that we do need a massive effort in terms of building the local capacity in developing countries to formulate their own negotiating positions, starting from their own realities. Sometimes they have good economists, but they don't have the institutions to make the most of those human resources, and I do intend to do our best in UNCTAD to devote more and more resources to human resources training and education.
Let me just add one more point here, which I think Ruben's made, and that is I think we need also to help reform some of the universities. Because the universities are very good in providing some theoretical instruction, but not how to apply this in the real world situation. And as you put it, Rubens, the reality of some of these countries, and how do you reinterpret your interests, and how do you apply the rules in the context of the realities faced all around the world. And I think that requires a new type of instruction. And we have been trying to do that at the Monterey Institute, I think, as you may have seen in the simulations.
Very good. Our next question is from La Universidad Espíritu Santo in Guayaquil, in Ecuador.
The question is the following. How can you counteract the negotiators from the small or underdeveloped countries, the pressure they are under when they have official negotiators from developed countries who impose trade agreements that only favor these the developed and powerful countries?
Mr. Recupero.
Well, I believe that the best way of countering this pressure is to build up alliances and coalitions, because even the weakest countries, they can build alliance around a common interest. We have had a few remarkable experiences like the alliance of agricultural exporters or textile exporters during the Uruguay round. So when you alone is not strong enough, you have to build alliance with other countries or with the consumer in industrial countries, the consumer and the importers of your products.
Our next question is from la Universidad del Caribe en Santo Domingo, en la República Dominicana.
Gracias, buenos días.
Good morning. Thank you. What are the most important difficulties or the greatest difficulties faced by the younger, the smaller countries like the Dominican Republic, weak country, that don't have trained people in commercial diplomacy? What are their chances of getting good agreements advantageous to their countries and their private sector enterprises and outfits?
Well, I think building on the themes we have discussed earlier, what they really need to do is to try to team up with neighboring countries, share some of the resources, and then try to make sure they get some trained people. There's really no alternative.
Our next call is from la Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá, en la ciudad de Panamá, en Panamá.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Precisely because talking about education and training in Latin American countries, this is a question for Mr. Recupero. Do you think that the United Nations could sponsor some sort of project where we could have some training here in Panama? Perhaps this is a possibility, and that we can invite our Central American and South American countries to come here and join us here in some postgraduate program from the Monterey Institute. Perhaps we can join efforts here and we can all come to Panama for training.
Yes, it is exactly what we intend to do. You know, I came here and with Geza's help and Dr. Miguel Cárdenas' help, we want to join forces. We already have at our organization a program called Train for Trade. It is training for foreign trade personnel. And we do exactly what you suggested. We organized workshops, and we could do it in Panama for the countries of the Central American region. And I would like only to add, because many of the questions are related to this problem, that the reason why there are so few trained commercial negotiators is because only recently people are becoming aware of the importance of commercial negotiations. That was not so in the past, so it is a new challenge, and for a new challenge we have to develop a new response.
Our next question is from the Instituto Politécnico Nacional de Educación Continua del Distrito Federal de México.
Bueno, sí. Habla Ignacio Peón.
My name is Ignacio Peón from the Polytechnical Institute in Mexico. I think that what you are presenting is good, but I think it's very innocent, naive rather. Certainly in a negotiation, it is very important to know technical aspects, cultural aspects, and language aspects, etc. But I think the political aspect has something to do with power, the balance of power, and this you haven't mentioned in your presentation. I would like you to mention a little bit, elaborate a little bit on that. Of course, we need symmetry in the power relations, and I think that's important. But will you please talk a little bit about this?
If you allow me, in my presentation, it comes next. I address this question because, as you can understand, we divided the subject between the two of us. I tried not to repeat what Geza said and to touch on other aspects, but I highlighted the fact that every negotiation, not only in the international sphere, but even in the private sector, is always a negotiation about power. In the commercial negotiations, what is characteristic is the power of your market. What counts is the interest of your counterpart in your market. So there is always an element of power, sometimes of imbalance, but one has to be realistic and to try to handle this difference in size of markets in an efficient way, trying to exchange concessions that are more or less similar in value. That is the soul of a commercial negotiation.
I should just like to, and I think that's certainly the case, but there's also the power of ideas, because there are certain commonly accepted rules, there are certain common notions of what is fair, what is a level playing field, and so a small country who is able to have effective advocates of what is right and build a consensus among countries can go a long way. And that, of course, in addition to doing the other things that Rubens discussed earlier, which is to build coalitions and alliances. Again, a small country that's very effective in building coalitions and alliances can go a long way. Hong Kong does not have a lot of power, but Hong Kong is very effective in international negotiations, as I think Rubens will testify.
Gentlemen, thank you. Let us begin now with Module 2, in which Mr. Recupero will share his personal experiences and tell us a bit about the three main stages of trade negotiations.
Thank you. Speaking after my good friend Geza Fiketikuti makes it much easier for me to convey to you what I feel is essential about trade diplomacy. He has already covered all the main elements that you should know about commercial diplomacy in general. So I will try not to repeat what he said, but instead will concentrate on my own personal experiences in this field. If you allow me, I would like to tell you what this experience has been. For many years I was a trade negotiator in the old GATT, and during that period I have been the chairman of the so-called informal group of developing countries. I was the chairman of the council and of the contracting parties of the GATT during the negotiations of the Uruguay round. So my knowledge about trade negotiations is mostly something I learned through personal experience. I never had any particular experience in formally studying the subject. Let me start with what Geza mentioned. Nowadays, trade negotiations have become a sort of way of life. You have trade negotiations going on all the time. This was not true in the past. In the old GATT, 50 years ago, there were 23 countries, and only from time to time would there be rounds of negotiations. That is, a cycle of negotiations with a date to start and a deadline to finish. The cycles covered different matters to allow for cross-concessions, and the interval you would have many years to prepare for the next round. Nowadays, we have almost continuous negotiations. Currently, at the World Trade Organization, there are negotiations regarding financial services. In Latin America, in a matter of some months, we are going to start negotiations dealing with the free trade area of the Americas. The same thing happens all over the world, on the Asian continent, in Africa, etc. So one doesn't have enough time to prepare. Sometimes one negotiation is immediately followed by another. Only a few weeks ago in Geneva, negotiators were still grappling with information technology products. Now they have already started to negotiate on financial services, a completely different subject. The problem is not so much to understand this change, but to prepare for the challenge that is required from all of us. And I would like to stress in particular the special difficulties of developing countries. Because, as you know, when industrial countries approach negotiations, they have generally benefited from a long period of preparation and the support of public institutions, of research centers, and of appropriate organizations. That is not the case with developing countries. In order to give you a complete overview of what, in my opinion, is necessary to better prepare for negotiations, I would like to divide my comments into three main areas, or, if you will, three main stages: the pre-negotiating stage, the actual negotiations, and the post-negotiating stage. First, the pre-negotiating stage. It is extremely important to know that maybe 80% of the success of a negotiation depends very heavily on the quality of your preparation, on the amount of information, of analysis, of research that you have at your disposal. It is especially important to set very clear goals and a clear and realistic strategy to reach those goals. A concrete example is what happened with the Uruguay round of negotiations. The initial idea of beginning the round was presented around 1982. It took almost 4 years to prepare for the actual start of those negotiations, because most countries were just not prepared. My friend Geza Feketikuti was instrumental in preparing those negotiations as the chairman of the Trade Committee of the OECD, the Organization of Industrial Countries, and those countries were able to start with a good knowledge of the most important aspects involved in the negotiations on trade and services, for instance. But developing countries were not by far as prepared as the industrial ones. When I arrived in Geneva at the beginning of the Uruguay round in 1987, I found that most of the negotiations were still centering around problems which were in essence preliminary to the negotiations. For example, the definition of what exactly services are. What should be the statistical data for negotiations on services, and things like that. So it was only after almost 2 years spent in discussions about the preliminary issues that people were able to move to the phase of actual negotiations. The problem with the pre-negotiating phase is that many countries, I would say unfortunately most countries, don't have in place the structure necessary to prepare for commercial diplomacy. And that covers not only governments, but also the private sector. One of the major problems that I see is that even in some of the large developing countries, there is a lack of good interaction between the government and the business sector. Very often you have trade negotiations that are conducted and are concluded without adequate consultation with the private sector, with the businessmen, the people who really know what is at stake. And of course, that leads very frequently to disastrous results. That is why, before even considering the need to prepare negotiations, we should give attention to what we could call the institutional framework of the pre-negotiating phase. That is, the adequacy of the government institutions involved, the ministries dealing with trade and the foreign economic negotiations, the adequate coordination among those institutions in order to reach a consensus. At the same time, it is necessary to set up a good working interaction between those institutions of the government and the business sector. That is, in my opinion, absolutely essential, and for that goal I am convinced that it is necessary to have especially trained people in the business sector, people who would, first of all, test their negotiating abilities, your abilities, with their own government, your government, to try to convey to your official negotiators what you need from the negotiations. Another element I feel is absolutely essential in this kind of preparation is the availability of good analytical and research data about the issues that are going to be discussed. Unfortunately, in many developing countries, even when you have good universities, good departments of economics, you seldom have people who specialize in foreign trade, people who know not only about the economics of domestic agriculture, but who also know about the economics of agricultural trade, who are familiar with export subsidies, and who know how domestic support to agriculture will affect the negotiation of a trade agreement. So it is absolutely necessary for countries which are preparing to face this challenge of continuous negotiations to try to create or reinforce the basis of the support in research centers. In short, many developing countries have a purely negative, defensive agenda. They know what they don't want, but they don't know what they want. This is why we have to give developing countries a positive agenda through a well-prepared pre-negotiations phase. We have to empower them to know what they want and do need. That brings me to the second step, that is, the actual negotiations. One of the problems of actual negotiations, particularly of negotiations in the world of trade negotiations or of regional agreements, is the fact that although the private sector, the business community, should be the major driving force behind the negotiations, the representatives of the business community are not allowed to take part directly in them. The rules for official negotiations specify that the business community should not be allowed to take part directly in the negotiations because those negotiations take place exclusively among governmental officials. This is a problem that has to be dealt with by providing an efficient and effective communication and interaction process between the business sector and the official negotiators. Because negotiations, as you know, do not proceed smoothly they have many surprises. There are moments when unexpected events may take place,